Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Nancy Cellini. Thanks for being here. We know that your time is really precious to you and limited these days, and we're honored that you would be here. This is our third webinar in a series of six, designed exclusively for the biopharmaceutical industry on the topic of organizational change management. You don't have to attend all six, but if you see something interesting come across your desk from us and you can't attend, please feel free to share it with your colleagues who maybe are involved in OCM within your organization. Today, we're going to work to dispel some of the many myths surrounding this vital discipline to our industry. We have a technical guru in the background, Tony. You may hear me call upon him. He'll be helping us navigate the slides and some of the other things about the webinar. But before we get into the content, I want to tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we do. So on the next slide, I want to tell you that thinkocm.org was developed because after years of seeing big gaps in project work, vital project work, big, large, complex, global projects in this industry, we saw a real deficiency with having experts on teams who understand the depth and the important nature of the people side of change. And as a result of everybody working so hard these days, especially in this past year, there seem to be these unbelievable misunderstandings about what OCM is and how we work at the people side of change, and of course, what OCM isn't. As Think OCM, we're a group of independent experts in the pharmaceutical biopharma space. We're independent. That's really important. I often say we're Switzerland and neutral. We are free of competing priorities because we're not owned by any company. We come together to just do this work. We're all ProSci certified. Many of us are double and triple certified in multiple methodologies. But we're focused on deliverables that make a difference. We offer small, cost-effective teams to help you achieve your project outcomes. And given that background and the depth of the decades of experience that I've had in this industry, combined with my doctorate in public health, my seasoned years in technology, education, training, and systems, you probably guessed I only work with other experts who have similar backgrounds and interesting backgrounds in terms of rounding out this team. And today I'm really delighted and honored to introduce my colleague, Lori Janasco. Lori, say hi to our audience.
Thank you, Nancy, and welcome everyone. My name is Lori Janasco, and I've been leading change in organizations for the good part of 20 years now. But I didn't start my career in OCM. I actually started my career in traditional corporate communications. And I worked for many, many years in the pharmaceutical and the biopharmaceutical industry before transitioning to work exclusively with clients in the field of OCM. Now, Nancy and I have been doing these webinars for a few months now, and we're particularly excited for today's session. Over the course of the many OCM engagements we've had, we've definitely seen our fair share of misconceptions about how OCM works and various expectations about what OCM can deliver. As a result, one of the first things we do is work with our clients so that they understand exactly what they need to do and what to expect, and more importantly, how they're going to be participating in that process. We do this with coaching, advisory sessions, and we try to start very early in the process so that we can deliver a roadmap to avoid any unnecessary surprises. As Nancy mentioned, OCM is all that we do, and as one of the only independent teams in the industry, we believe our clients rest easy knowing it's our primary focus. So we truly hope you enjoy our presentation about common OCM myths, and we look forward to talking to you a bit more at the end and answering some of your individual questions. Nancy.
Thanks, Lori. Here's our agenda for today. As you'll see, we'll start with a kind of a historical perspective that is critically important to ground us in the importance of this discipline. Then we'll move into our myths and we'll talk about some guidelines and some things to help you out in terms of planning your OCM strategy and approach. The content portion of our webinar today is 30 minutes. After that, we're going to cut away and do a Q&A session. They're always very interesting, but if you're pressed for time, we understand if you have to end early, but you really want to stay with us as much as you can, as long as you can for the content portion. So let's get at it. The history of OCM is a very interesting tour, not through, what is OCM today in the way of a practice, but more, how did it get there? What are the elements that have made OCM OCM? And I'm going to start with perhaps one of the earliest OCM or change managers being Charles Darwin. When he wrote about species and survival and adaptability, I would tell you that's a good framing of OCM. We look at the people side of change. We work at the people side of change to help people accept, become aware, understand, and adapt to big transitions and big transformations. And we've worked across a lot of them. So, starting very early in the pre 1900s, we got very interested, especially in the United States, about productivity. We had the industrial age booming, or the industrial revolution, and this brought with it the needs to really understand how organizations could be formed better, structured better, people skills. For people who don't know who Frederick Taylor was and the scientific method, or Kurt Lewin, we're really robbing OCM of some of the important roots. They were some of the earliest influencers, along with a group of other great minds who looked at ways to enable organizations to be more productive, to be more efficient, more effective, and certainly more profitable. But it's very interesting that this discipline started with its roots in industrial psychology, organizational design and development, and a whole host of other types of sciences ranging from psychology to engineering, statistics. And that's really when we saw this study of change and adaptability start to emerge. I'm going to fast forward us right into the 1900s and spare you a lot of other text-based learning. You can do that on your own. But 1990s brought about a very important person in the business sector, Jack Welch. Jack Welch brought to GE change. He brought not only change, but deep and lasting change. Jack Welch also brought his knowledge of Six Sigma from his prior experiences and is credited today as Neutron Jack, having some of the earliest OCM projects. And one time he made a quote that I think is very significant today. He used to talk about change all the time. And one time he said, if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. And we don't want to be doom and gloom today, but something else that's very striking happened in the 2000s as we were nearing the 2000s. And it's important today as we frame OCM in this industry. Round about that time, we started to see groups of software developers and system designers who were really fed up with the long life cycles and onerous development schedules. They're moving away from waterfall in deference to something faster, better, and more adaptable. I bring you the Agile Manifesto. If you're not familiar with that work, during this time, when this group of software developers met seeking a better way, it's a really vital read. And it's a read on a group of principles. Agile by itself is not a methodology. It's often misstated as that way. During that same time, we saw Scrum, Lean, continuous improvement, as I said, the SDLC, and lighter weight models so that we could bring about technology. And that's where we really are today. All of those methods and all of those techniques and all of that knowledge really has converged into what I would call modern day OCM. And there's some famous names, John Cotter, the ProSci company, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. They were all big contributors to this knowledge base today. But Lori and I are going to talk to you more about why this knowledge base has been so watered down. And I think that's where our misunderstanding is, Lori. So I'm going to turn it over to you to get us into the myths.
Thank you, Nancy. And let's get right into it with myth number one. So many times we hear folks refer to OCM as the soft discipline, the nice to have. And it's often put in the context of OCM is nice to have, but the real work is project management. And we don't have time to spend on a focus on a discipline that's a soft discipline. Now, Nancy, I know you have a lot to say about this one.
I certainly do, Lori. And since I just covered the history of how we got into OCM, I want to start out by saying that OCM is hardly a soft science. OCM, in fact, is a robust and very rigorous scientific discipline and approach to understanding how we bring about change. I think that this is really a big disconnect here, though. And I'm glad you made it our first myth so we could debunk it. And as the research and science lead for our organization, I'm going to point to the research. It's my habit. It's the one I'm always sticking to. And science, we believe, right? McKinsey has done some really compelling research on this very topic. And they reported in one of their very important studies that they did on this that projects with excellent OCM behind them achieve ROIs, return on investment, of 143%. Those projects with poor or no OCM on average only achieved 35%. So I'm going to ask everybody to pause there. Think about the magnitude of expensive technologies being brought in and having them fail simply because people don't understand them. OCM is hardly a soft science, Lori. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Nancy. And those insights are very, very helpful. And before we end with myth number one, I'm just going to give you a real life example. So I once had a situation where I was consulting on a very large acquisition. However, the project team was very late to involve OCM. So many of the work streams were already moving forward when I joined. This often happens when OCM is an afterthought or considered not quite as critical as other work streams. And when something like this happens, it makes the situation very challenging because it creates a risk in the area of messaging and communications. When OCM is late to the table, there's a gap that often gets filled with rumors and misinformation. And it's very difficult to rein this in once it gets started. And it will have an impact on your project in the form of increased resistance, misaligned messaging, and various levels of frustration among your stakeholders until OCM can get up to speed and course correct. So the reality is that project ROI is directly tied to how well people adopt change. And when you look at it through this lens, it's not such a soft discipline after all. So let's move on to myth number two. This one I like, and it always makes me laugh a bit, but OCM has a magic wand that fixes almost everything. So we've all been there, and the nature of our work puts us in this very unique situation, especially when we're with clients who we are often seen as advisors or counselors. And this really is for all aspects of the project, and it often translates to problem solvers. So while we do like to solve problems for our clients, it's important to remember that your OCM leader has a very specific role and work stream in the organization, and it's directly related to managing the people side of change. We often joke with our clients by saying nothing productive happens on a Friday after 3 o'clock. And we say this because we've been in countless situations where our clients come to us with something that's totally unrelated to OCM, and they expect that we can somehow help them fix it overnight. Now, Nancy, I know you've been in this situation as well. What have you experienced?
Oh my goodness. Well, that instant fix, the fast fix, it doesn't work. And no, we don't have magic capes or wands. We're not superheroes either. This is hard work, ladies and gentlemen, and we do it side by side with project managers and business leaders and oftentimes science liaisons in the type of work that we do. Remember too that this discipline is rooted in sociology, psychology, just to name a few of them. An integrated plan created by OCM experts in the earliest phases of a project is what really helps to guide that project forward. And I'm going to talk from my experience about one particularly challenging area of technology. I work and specialize in translational research. And coming from a research background myself, I absolutely love the topic and love the area, but it's one that can be met with great resistance within an organization. And there's a reason. One is kind of obvious, that researchers versus clinical trial people may have a natural adversarial relationship with one another when it comes to the data. Translational research has also had difficulty doing reproducibility of results. But all that aside, I'm going to point us to the BMC collection. They have a very large journal collection actually devoted to translational research. They've shed a lot of light on this, and one particular author, Seyhan, Seyhan, reported that there's much more to the resistance for translational research than just the idea. There can be structural, organizational roadblocks, funding issues, lack of collaboration, and certainly a lack of understanding between the groups who now have to work very closely together to bring about a change as large as translational research. So in a recent project, I will tell you, and I take great pride in this project lasted several years, was a huge investment for the company, and it was going nowhere fast. It was the OCM interventional plan of gathering people through a group of symposia and consortiums and talking sessions who worked out their differences and worked on things such as terminology. What does this mean? Where are we going with it? So we did save the day in that one. It certainly wasn't a magic wand, Lori, and you remember I spent countless hours talking and meeting with executives and the scientific groups and the researchers to really move that forward. So hard work, but well worth it when you see a project that was almost tanked go forward and be a success.
That's right. I remember that one very well, Nancy, and how hard you guys worked to get that back on track. So those are some really great examples. And just to summarize this myth, you know, OCM strategy and tactics are really meant to advance very specific goals that are directly related to moving people up the change curve. And sometimes that requires a lot of OCM, while other times it requires only a small amount of support. So when you embark on the OCM journey and you're looking at an outside consultant or an individual who you're going to bring into the organization to help you, it's really important to ask them about their methodology and make sure that it works for your team and your organization. OCM is not one size fits all. It's a very customizable discipline. And an expert OCM advisor will be able to work with you very closely to make a customized plan that really suits your needs. So moving on to myth number 3, OCM is just an enhanced communications plan. And this is one that you're particularly passionate about, Nancy. So I'm just going to introduce it very quickly and I'm going to hand it back to you. So
Thank you.
Sure. We hear this a lot from our clients. And it's usually from clients who are not accustomed to working with OCM or who do not have a dedicated OCM leader. It's almost as if they believe that OCM is just another way to say corporate communications. And this makes a lot of sense because even though OCM has been around and the methodologies have been used in organizations since the 1990s, many companies would often turn to their communications department to lead and manage early OCM efforts. And just as an example from real life, not too long ago, I was working with a company on an internal process transformation. And during one of the meetings, one of the project team members turned to me and asked, "So, How long will it be before we get an OCM or a communications plan? And when he said that, I knew immediately that we would have some work to do in the area of OCM coaching. So Nancy, I know that you've had these experiences as well. Do you have any specific examples?
Yeah, I sure do, Lori. And I'd even say beyond the numerous examples I could cite from my own experience, what I've seen most often is an OCM communications plan used as an excuse for poor or poorly understood OCM. And I must say that this has to do with experience and understanding what the research says on this one. Because let me tell you, if OCM and change were so easy to obtain in any organization, knowing this industry, knowing the unbelievable great groups who do those communications from public affairs to corporate affairs, there's all kinds of communicators clear throughout these organizations. If communications was the magic wand in this case, or the magic pill, slam dunk, it would be easy, right? We could just send really good messages to everybody and be done with it. But that's not what the research says. And on this one, I'm going to give it to ProSci. ProSci has a knowledge base that spans almost 3 decades now. They started as purely researchers. So I really take what they have to say to heart. They have found through their research and studying multiple project outcomes that communications is not the #1 contributor. It's actually #5 on a list of the top 5 contributors. So if nothing else makes you look at this a little bit differently, I think it should be their research. Actually, #1 continues to be the engagement of the executive sponsor as the primary person pushing and pulling that project forward. Dedicated change management is #2. The use of a structured process is #3. Employee engagement participation is #4. And #5 is communications. So I wish it were that easy, Lori. And I wish I had $1 for every time I heard, you're going to write the communication plan, right? Well, the communication plan is only, I almost feel like it's a smaller portion of everything else we need to put in place first. If that's all done well and well executed and thoughtfully designed, the communications plan almost becomes organic to it. And Lori, I know you have lots of experience in this area, so I'll turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, and just as a takeaway and to bust this myth, a strategic OCM is very different from communications, and a comprehensive strategy includes many more components. And if we could just flip to the next slide. And for those of you who may not be aware of those components, these are just some of them that I listed. And when you are working with a good OCM practitioner, they really are going to consider the following. They're going to work with your sponsors. They're going to have a very defined sponsorship plan that really outlines the timelines, the key messages, and the activities that your sponsor should be performing in order to support your project. They will also work with you on a readiness assessment, and that's just taking some time to really analyze the organization so that you know where you are on the change curve and where you need to be. We'll do the stakeholder assessment, which is perhaps one of the most important assessments we do, and that tells you who the audience is. Who are you actually going to be talking to when you write your communications? And we will also do an impact assessment. And this gets a little deeper into sort of that audience and how it affects the audience. So how are your stakeholders going to be affected? What is their future state going to look like? And how is that different from the state that they're living in now? And then finally, I want to say a word about engagement planning. So engagement planning is when you have special activities that you are going to do that help get people really engaged in the project. And these can be things like demos, if you're doing a technology implementation, lunch and learns, when we were all back in the office, and hopefully we'll be back in there soon. Lunch and learn events are a great way to help get people engaged. And then also short and long-term recognition programs where you can really celebrate wins and key milestones and really highlight and profile some of the folks that are doing all of that hard work around change. So there are a multitude of things that you can do beyond communications that will help bring people to the full adoption of the change. Okay, so let's move on to the next myth. People just don't like change. Well, change is difficult for everyone because it introduces uncertainty into our lives. And it is true that many times there is real change saturation in an organization. And it's important to recognize this when you're planning and timing your transformations and your implementations. And we realize that many of us, we don't have a lot of leeway for when those transformations take place. But it is important to recognize when your organization has that change saturation, because you can often have conversations with sponsors or some folks on the executive team and perhaps negotiate an implementation move or a timeline move, just to make sure that people aren't getting too many things sort of put on their plate at one time and they don't get into sort of that change saturation mode, because you want to try to really avoid that. And if you put this into the context of real life, I just want to leave you with one thought. So think about the last time you moved your residence. Most likely it was pretty stressful. So even if your move was a good one, you probably felt some stress. Change in an organization is the same way, because it introduces a little bit more work at the beginning. People need to learn a new way of doing things. There's also some uncertainty and some disruption in the organization. But regardless of the change, it's normal for people to feel a certain level of discomfort. So Nancy, do you also find this to be true?
Absolutely, Lori. And here's where I really want to stop and pause and talk about the serious nature of the work that we do. We work at the people side of change. That's who we are. That's what we do. I could start and end this conversation with the fear factor, because I've seen it so often, whether it's fear of losing a job or fear of keeping up and developing the new skills. We are human beings. And as far as I know, we really don't show up with different wiring in our work life versus our personal life. So think about fear emanating from a loss of control. And our psychological colleagues have proven this and demonstrated this over decades of tons and tons of research. And simply put, the majority of people don't love change. They may not particularly dislike it, but they may not love it either. And this comes from our human pre-wiring. We seek a state of steadiness. Think of diets not working. Think of exercise programs not working. We're pre-wired to like things the way they are, and our brains actually will seek it. We're humans. We like controlled environments. We don't like chaos. And when things are poorly executed in a particular project, or we feel at risk some way, Maslow's hierarchy, for those of you who remember that, and I'm not asserting here that you need to be an educational psychologist or an industrial one, but it's really important to remember how human we all are. And we bring all of that to the job environment. So leaders need to understand the predictable universal sources of resistance. And I see this all the time as well in my love job as a yoga therapist, where I'm trying to help people to change. It is very predictable, especially when someone has been facing deep trauma. And in that work, I want to give you the good news too. While people can be very traumatized by poor change and other circumstances in their life, there's a whole new body of knowledge on what's called not post-traumatic stress syndrome, but instead is called post-traumatic growth. And it talks about people's resilience. And if you look at countless psychology and management studies on this topic, and I would point you to everything from human relations to psychology today, being connected to the human side and how people view change is critical as an OCM leader. And it's therefore critical that your OCM leaders understand this. And let me end this, my portion of it, with a quote from Peter Drucker, another great change agent. He said that even when managers intellectually understand the need for changes in the way they must operate, they sometimes are emotionally just unable to make that transition. Think about that. We do all the time, and that's why we design interventions that really focus on the people side of change. So thanks, Lori. That's a really important one, and really important to take us back to what we do on a day in and day out basis. Back to you.
That's right. And just to summarize, busting this myth, the reality is, as Nancy said, most people just don't like poorly managed change. And it really seems like common sense, but people really just want to know that they're part of the change and that they have some control over what will happen to them and when. But as you can see, there's a lot that goes into proper OCM planning that enables this transition to appear seamless. And as we conclude this presentation, I'm going to hand it back over to Nancy, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the unique things that we do as an organization and a group of individuals to really help our clients work through their OCM projects and set them on the right track. Nancy?
Thanks, Lori. So here's some guidelines for you, some things to consider as you are thinking about buying OCM or getting OCM services from a team. We have stressed the need for independence. I'm going to stress that again. Really important that we're able to speak up, speak across, speak outside, and speak to everybody who has a part in that change. And most importantly, when things are not going well, the fact that we are not tied to a vendor or parent company in this case, who is maybe delivering the technology or the process engineering, allows us to remain neutral. It allows us to remain independent and be your source of truth telling on, how is this really going? Are people rolling their eyes in the workshop and talking behind their hands? Those are never good optics for a project, right, Lori? And of course, one size doesn't fit all. Lori already very elegantly laid that out. We fit the OCM strategy to the needs, and not all projects are intergalactic in size. So it's really important that you have a team who can work in an agile way. We now know a little bit more about agile today, and OCM should be a specialty. There's just too much at stake in our industry these days to have people who maybe have the best of intentions, but don't have the depth of experience that an OCM professional really truly needs to have in this industry. And that's why we're also very open to continuing conversations in this industry. We're working on that right now to have an open, independent group where these matters can be discussed even further as an industry. I did that work back in the late 1990s, early 2000s with the DIA when the EDMS reference model was developed. As one of the original authors of that model, we came together to solve common problems. I think we've got some to solve still in this discipline, Lori, and come up with a set of best practices. So before we close, here are some questions. I want you to use these as guidelines. If you answer, and the way you answer these questions are in the affirmative to most of them, those are some good indicators of what you need to do for your projects. Of course, if you answer no to the second one, now knowing what you know about OCM and why it is so critically important, and the executive sponsor role, these can be signs of risk. If you are faced with multiple challenges in the way of big projects this year, even more the reason why you need to assess your OCM needs. And we're going to take it one step further. We're going to invite you to come to our website, shown on the next slide. It's think-ocm.org. And on that website, you'll find our free online survey, no commitment, no obligation whatsoever. You can do the survey, get the data, use it as you need to for your own information or planning purposes, or you can take our next step free and again, no obligation. You can have a 1 hour consultation with us about what you see and what we see as OCM professionals very independently about your effort. So feel free to visit us there. And before we close the content portion and we go to the Q&A, which I know some of you can't remain for, I want to thank you all and tell you how vital it is that we all continue this important work in this industry that still seeks to end and ease human suffering and disease. That's what we all do. That's what gets me up every morning. And I continue to remain inspired, grateful, and thankful for all the work that you all do. So thanks so much for being here. And we're going to go to the Q&A now and end the content session. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Tony. Let's do some questions.